Welcome to Week 8. Our topic this week is conservation biology and ethics. Conservation biologists tend to have a skewed perspective of the value of biodiversity and tend to think others share their perspective. Because so much of conservation biology lies outside the realm of biology, it is in the biologist's self-interest to staunchly support their own perspective as the universal one. Environmental philosophers tend to divide our value into main types: instrumental or utilitarian, and intrinsic or inherent. Utilitarian is the value that something has as a means to another's ends. Intrinsic is the value that something has as an end to itself. Humans view themselves as having great intrinsic value, but the intrinsic value of the rest of biodiversity is of great debate. As a consequence of the rather recent and somewhat provocative suggestion, many conservationists adhere to a strictly utilitarian perspective, a very anthropocentric view. Three basic categories: goods, services, and information, but we could also add a psycho-spiritual value. So 4 categories of the instrumental value of biodiversity: for goods, food, fuel, fiber, medicine; services, pollination, recycling, nitrogen fixation; information, genetic engineering, pure science; and psycho-spiritual, aesthetic beauty, religious awe, scientific knowledge. Goods. Humans use many living things for many purposes. While humans consume more than 12,000 species of plants, most routinely eat 6 to 8 cultivated crops, and rice and wheat are huge. Only a small fraction of plants have been investigated for their potential as food, medicine, or fiber. For example, the Madagascar periwinkle was discovered in the 1950s and is now the preferred treatment for childhood leukemia. Services. There are many services provided by functioning ecosystems. If the Gaia hypothesis is correct, then salinity and temperature are organically regulated. The human economy is just a sub-economy of nature's economy, and clearly our impact is felt in virtually every aspect of worldwide ecosystems. Information. Each species' genome is a storehouse of information. Given all the potential uses of genetically engineering everything, genes can be thought of as invaluable. As we discussed, we have only discovered 20 to 40% of species. Consequently, one could argue preservation is simply in our own self-interest. Psychospiritual. Aldo Leopold had hoped through science people would acquire a refined taste in natural objects. Wilson finds special wonder, awe, and mystery in nature, which he calls biophilia, which he suggests lies at the foundation of a religion of natural history. Intrinsic value cannot be further reduced or categorized. It is discussed in terms of the sorts of things that may possess intrinsic value and whether intrinsic value exists subjectively or is subjectively conferred. The biocentric environmental philosophers who claim that intrinsic value exists subjectively in human beings and other organisms as follows. An organism is self-organizing and self-directed. How are organisms self-directed? Interests may be intelligibly attributable to organisms, but not to machines. However, conservation biologists are really not interested in the well-being of individuals, but rather the preservation of species, health and integrity of ecosystems, and evolutionary and ecological processes. Ralston argues that because a basic evolutionary goal of an organism is to reproduce, its species is therefore one of its primary goods. Since species evolve in a matrix of ecosystems, they too have value. Evolutionary processes going back to the Big Bang produced beings with goods of their own, so they also have intrinsic value. Finally, the diversity of organisms existed before we did and facilitated our own evolution. Therefore, it also has intrinsic value. More strictly following the classical distinction between objective facts and subjective values, some environmental philosophers argue that all value, including intrinsic value, is subjectively conferred. That is, no conscious subjects, no value. Since we can confer value onto other subjects, other species, and the hierarchically ordered biotic communities and ecosystems to which we human beings belong are no less than our fellow human beings and our hierarchically ordered human communities. the sorts of entities that we should value intrinsically. It is important to remember intrinsic and utilitarian values are not mutually exclusive and can be valued for both their utility and themselves. In fact, some, for example Norton, have argued that some environmental philosophers have done more harm than good for the cause of conservation. Why? Because the intrinsic value issue divides conservationists into two mutually suspicious factions, anthropocentrics versus the bio and ecocentrists. Ecocentrists regard anthropocentrists as shallow resourcists, and the latter think ecocentrists have gone off the deep end. Norton argues that we really don't need to appeal to the intrinsic value of biodiversity upon which to base conservation policy. Attributing intrinsic values to biodiversity, however, makes a practical difference in one fundamental way that Norton seems not to have considered. If biodiversity's intrinsic value were as widely recognized as is the intrinsic value of human beings, would it make much difference? It might if we consider shifting the burden of proof. When biodiversity is only instrumentally valuable, developers' burden of proof is on the conservationists. When biodiversity is intrinsically as well as instrumentally valuable, the burden of proof then lies with the developers. Monetizing the value of biodiversity, where the instrumental value to humans is expressed in monetary terms, is a technical task for economists. While some environmental economists explicitly endorse a strict anthropocentrism, however, even the intrinsic value of biodiversity can be taken into account in an economic assessment of conservation goals. Consider the actual market value for some endangered species. Elephants, rhinos, baleen whales, and tigers all have high economic values. Can this be used to conserve a species? Myers suggests using modern economic theory, which necessitates transforming a species market price from a conservation liability into a conservation asset, is to take it out of a condition that economists call a commons and enclose it. Enclosing means assigning the rights to cull the species in question. However, a wild species that has a market value is subject to overharvesting when property rights to it cannot be legitimately asserted and enforced. But it would work if it were protected. This can lead to the tragedy of the commons. A side note, another potential problem is the slow rate of return. It has been argued that in some cases, for example the blue whale, it is more economical to hunt an animal to extinction and then invest the money. Another potential pitfall of using a strictly utilitarian approach is potential goods such as new foods, fuels, medicines, and such have no market price. In the stock market they address this problem by using options, which is the amount people would be willing to pay in advance to guarantee an option for future use. The option price for any given species may be relatively small, given the small potential return. However, the sum option prices of the million or more species currently threatened with wholesale extinction might add up to a large sum. Of course, many species are going to have relatively little value. In fact, it is likely these species whose members are the fewest in number, the rarest, and the most narrowly distributed, in short, the ones most likely to become extinct. There are indirect market value prices placed on biodiversity, such as user fees, such as national park entrances, hunting licenses. Many environmental economists attempt to expand the economic value to include other commodities, such as gas, lodging, food, that is consumed when visiting these areas. Economists also attempt to account for the existence value in which people take some satisfaction in knowing that biodiversity is there and being protected. One way to assess the existence value is to calculate the amount of people that contribute to organizations dedicated to protecting species, even if they may never see them. And here are some of those organizations. It appears that we really have two parallel and mutually incommensurable systems for determining the value of things, the market and the ballot box. Everything can be and is monetized, including you. The ESA was a political attempt to stop monetizing biodiversity, recognizing the typical inherent tension between political and monetary values. In 1978, the ESA was amended to create a high-level interagency committee, the God Squad, which would allow a project that put a listed species in jeopardy of extinction if economics justified it. In traditional Western religions and philosophical traditions, only humans are worthy of ethical consideration. All else is typically regarded as just a means to the ends. The term dominion is used to justify one's actions. However, Norton has already shown that anthropocentrism can still be a strong advocate for biodiversity. An anthropocentric conservation ethic would require individuals, corporations, and other interest groups to fairly consider how their actions that directly affect the natural environment. The problem of conservation is frequently framed as one of satisfying human needs and wants at the expense of other species. However, not all people equally share the burden of conservation. Who is taking on more of that burden? Who is causing the problems? Take the case study of the lynx. See the resources lessons section and use this information to complete this week's forum assignment.